Let's leave this for just a second, and I'd like to look at the Tragicommedia style sheet for recitar cantando. So Tragicommedia is a group from Europe, really, really good, and they had some brilliant continuo players, and they hired wonderful singers, and I got the opportunity to do some tours with them years ago. Were just amazing. They were amazing. So they have this little style sheet for how to sing recitative in the 17th century. You have it in your handouts. Chris, you're going to post that?
I will, yeah.
I mean, bring it up on the screen.
Sure.
Great. So a lot of the stuff is kind of basic musicianship with a skew towards what they did in 17th century. There's a lot of 17th century singers were incredibly well trained. They usually started as kids, pretty much always, and they could sight sing anything. They worked with teachers from a young teen age, and of course, they had everything from basses to castrati, who were the male sopranos who had their hormonal release interrupted at something like 11, 12, 13, maybe even 14, and so their voices didn't change, and they were the rock stars of the age until they were banned, and they sang in churches as well as the opera house. The other thing that's weird about them is their bones didn't really stop growing. So they were very tall, gangly, had huge rib cages because your ribs are what keep your lungs from expanding forever. So without the ribs holding them in, your lungs could really expand. But anyway, that's just part of it. So just a few simple rules. They're very didactic, this group. The first 7 rules define the limits. The following 7 suggest some freedoms. We're going to go through it and actually maybe even slightly debunk a few things. In later styles, the notation degenerates to a few standard patterns, relying on the singers to make up suitable rhythms. But early 17th century composers carefully notated a richly varied and subtly chosen recitation. We should respect it and only depart from it once we're sure of the underlying intentions. So what they're saying is that there's a certain regularity, which is called abbattuta. So it doesn't really mean, it means on the beat, but it doesn't mean by measure, which some people translate it. And it doesn't mean that you don't have freedom within the expression of the beat. Beats are big, but you definitely want to express the words the way you would speak them, but you don't want to take too much time in regular recitation, recitative. They say learn the bass part too, which is of course important. So when you're learning recitative, when you're learning anything, make sure you learn the bass part. You know where their beats are and where they play chords when you don't sing, and how they're going to fit into what you want to do and how you have to fit into what they have written. So your ideal continuo partner will play the bass just where you want it, but only if you know where it is. In particular, look for cadences with the characteristic strong, weak phrasing, always matching the articulation of the text, etc. In most languages, especially in Italian, you have strong and weak beats. So when you're singing recitative, if you can, you really try and observe the strong beats and the weak beats. Sometimes you don't do it because you can't. It's not written that way, and it's possibly purposely written that way. On the beat or off the beat. So long notes have different effects depending on whether they are on the beat or across the beat with a strong beat in the middle of them. And it doesn't matter if the continuo play in the middle of the beat or wherever it is. This includes every dotted note, which has a beat in the middle of it, so to speak, on the dot and ties over. So if you understand that, when you have a dotted note or when you're singing over what would be a beat, you have to recognize where that is, and that helps you shape your notes. Many phrases begin after a short rest, and singer and continuo should feel the preceding downbeat together, whether or not a chord is played. Sometimes there will be a chord played, sometimes you decide not to. And so then you don't have to worry so much as do you play the chord there, because you still observe the beat of whether it's a rest or not. And once a rhythm is established, it just continues, meaning it doesn't sort of devolve into something random, it keeps going. Cadences don't need rallentando, best controlled by messo di voce shape to the penultimate strong syllable. Here's something that I only partially agree with. I don't think you need to start slowing down a long time before a cadence, but of course you want to take time. Something we'll discover in other readings, other writings, is that you need to let everyone know where the next downbeat is going to be and where the cadence is. And so taking a little bit of time is usually a very good idea, but not too big a time. I like to define it in this way. If you're singing off a quarter note and you want to make it a little longer, you can, but don't ever let it turn into a half note. And the other way, if you're singing an eighth note and you want to sing them faster, you can sing them a little faster or accelerate them, but don't ever let them become 16 notes, because then you're out of the rhythmic sorting. Final notes on weak syllables can be tailed off to allow the music to repose and the singer to breathe without disturbing the rhythm. So what they're suggesting is that when you need to take time at the end of a phrase, you can actually just release a little bit early, take your breath, and go on. Now, I think you should be free to create a new downbeat, as it were, but certainly don't have to take a long wait. So this helps you do it. Sometimes you want to take longer. And you do see fermatas written here and there. It's not completely unusual. Expressive words can be colored by equally expressive tone color from both the singer and the continuo. I think that's pretty obvious what that means. Normal words can be quote unquote spoken. So that's something I talked about a little bit earlier. That is, when you're doing recitative, you follow the rhythm of the words, especially when it's moving freely, as if you were reading the poetry. So don't worry about making it music, worry about making it speech. A new idea can have a new tempo. I would say, okay, but generally you don't want to make it too different unless the composer has written in a relation, a tempo relation, and they change the meter signs. And so when that happens, then I think you can come up with a new tempo, perhaps. But especially if you're doing something that's strophic or something that repeats, you don't want to all of a sudden do something really slow unless it's written out that way. Use rhythm to connect phrases. The long phrase of thought that sometimes has to span rest in the vocal part can be made clear by letting a clear rhythmic tempo continue normally, but not by truncating long notes or rests. So I hope that's clear. You can connect a thought over a rest, but don't do it by making the rest really short and jumping it, because then you're coming out of rhythm. So you get the idea that they try and keep you more or less within the notation that was possible then. Remember that notation in 17th century is limited compared to what we have now. They didn't have odd meters. They didn't expect you to find these tiny things. Well, put it this way, the composers or whomever, the copyists, didn't write out tiny things. You had to find them yourself. And I think that's enough of this style sheet. So I want to go on to some other thoughts. So that brings me to something again we'll talk about a little bit later, and that's called sprezzatura. And sprezzatura was defined by Castiglione in the Courtier as a certain noble negligence. And it doesn't mean that you're really negligent, but there's a certain beauty, a total nobility in having a lack of care seeming, although there's precision within that. And so it's a way of making up your own rhythm without destroying the rhythm. And you could say that some jazz singers now do that sort of thing. I think you have to be careful, of course, because you don't want to throw off the continuo, or if you're singing with other singers, your fellow singers. That's rude. But I think you can be free to put things a little bit in your own time. An example of that I like to talk about is Claudio Monteverdi in his Madrigals of Love and War, book 8. One of them is called Lamento della Ninfa. And there are 3 men who are like the chorus, and they describe the scene, and then she has an aria, and then they describe the scene again. And it's a bass line that doesn't ever change, at least in the aria. It's and then she sings over that. And what he said is the men and the continuo, when they're singing their outer movements and when the continuo is playing, to be abbattuta, to be on the beat as it is prescribed, but that the soprano, the shepherdess in this case, should sing to the beat of her own heart, which is a beautiful concept. And I think that it really means that she should be free to put her cadences slightly different. She can come in a little early, she can come in a little late, she can finish a section. And I've done this with some people, and I've heard other people do it. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't, it's awful. But so you have to be careful. But I think just the concept of being free, of using sprezzatura to move things around with freedom without getting, off the beat, without getting wild, is a great thing. So I'd like to go now to some vocal ornamentation as prescribed in one of the handouts. Does anyone have any questions yet? Okay, feel free when I ask if you have questions.
So were you saying that the continuo player is going to keep the exact same tempo, but the singer can have a little freedom to play around?
Well, yes. I mean, in that specific piece, that's what he's calling for. But I think in general, it's not that continuo players can't take time when they feel they need to, because you have to work with singers in continuo. But they tend to be more, on the beat. Now, if a singer is taking some time in recitative or whatever, then of course the continuo has to follow. But what I'm saying is, if the continuo is going to be, very measured, the singer can be a little off from that as long as you meet in certain places. And that's something that you have to figure out for yourself. I think that's what they were talking about, and that's what they expected. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So let's look at the Lucas Harris sheet vocal ornaments in the 17th century.
Screen share.
And he gives some, some nice examples from composers, all of whom were actually either players or singers or both as well. So, they're pretty good with performance practice. So I think the first thing he talks about is from Rognoni, who was a wind and viol player, but also wrote his passaggi for singers. And he says, emphasizes singing passaggi on the vowels. I don't really know what that means because I don't see how you could sing passaggi on a consonant, but I'm not going to try it. But anyway, I think he's talking about going from, vowel to vowel. And he has some little examples of rules, some of which are kind of odd. So the first thing, or so that's pretty rapid stuff, and that's all articulated. So you wouldn't sing, and the same thing with the next one. Now, in the next little musical example, I don't really agree with it, but he even changes it. I mean, he says that this only applies to basically to magical singing, to part songs. So you can't just sing certain kinds of ornaments if they're going to interfere with what other parts are singing. But if you're singing solo, of course, and you're having continuo, then you can do that most of the time. Even singing duets and trios with continuo, you can ornament in that way. So I don't know. I don't think there's much to go over. It's just something that Lucas points out that's kind of interesting. And so here we go into Caccini. I think we'll skip this and actually just do a Caccini section. You'll be seeing a facsimile of his musical examples, and you'll have a translation of what he wrote in his preface. The rest of this is mostly from Caccini, and he discusses a couple of things, beginning with a note from Caccini describes that all the time, and it's not but filling in those notes. So let's I think we can look at Caccini a bit now. So let's, if you can pull up the Caccini preface to the reader.
Got it.
It's long, so we're not going to go over the whole thing. We'll just look at some sections of it. What I like in the first paragraph is, after he does all this introduction, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the middle of the 6th line. But now seeing many of them going around tattered and spoiled, badly making use of those long vocal gyrations, simple and double, even redoubled, one twisted up with another, when they, that's my songs, were invented by me in order to avoid that antiquated style of passaggi, formerly the custom, but which is more appropriate for wind and instruments than for voice. Likewise, I see used indiscriminately vocal crescendos and decrescendos, exclamations, trilli and gruppi, and other such ornaments in a good style of singing. I have been required and also moved by my friends to have the said music printed and to show the reader in this first edition by means of this discourse the reasons that have induced me to such a manner of song for one voice alone, So that music in recent times, past not being accustomed to be a complete charm that I feel resonates in my soul, as I know, I may be able in these writings to leave some vestige of it, and so that someone else may be able to reach that perfection like a great flame from a small spark. So he's very wordy, and he, like other composers, I think what he's basically saying is do it pretty much the way I've written. I've written it this way because I don't want to hear too much ornamentation, too wild, people showing off, etc. Which means what? That they did it. You know, you see this in treatises all the time, in introductions and prefaces. You know, I hate to hear this and that and that. It just sounds bad and blah, blah, blah. But that just means everybody did it. So, you know, you have to make your own choices as to how florid you want to be. But I think his point is a good one. So let me go back to the starting of his school in the 1580s in Florence. And that their ideal was to capture the spirit of Greek plays and expressions, so the classical ideals. At this point in the late 15th, all through the 16th century, most music was done in, say, magical form of some sort, meaning multi-part singing, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 parts. And when that happens, especially when you're dealing with counterpoint, a lot of times the poetry, the words are obscured because it's very difficult to hear. You know, this is not homophonic music, this is contrapuntal music. So it's difficult to hear the poetry when you have voices singing different words at different times and even different lines of the poetry going on. And I think his group, the Camerata of Florence, wanted to change that and to come up with a new concept. Hence, the name of his book is The Nuove Musiche, the new music. And so what he and his fellow composers of the type were attempting to do was to make, as they said, the word be the mistress of the music. So the word has great importance, and they all refer to the poet that they were setting, whether the poetry was good or not. Frequently it is. They use a lot of the classics, Guarini and Tasso. By the time you get to this solo singing type, you don't really have that much of, say, Petrarch or, you know, the 14th and 15th century great poets that were so beloved by the magical composers of the 16th century. But anyway, the idea is that the words have clarity and that everything you sing and the way that you sing and the way the music is composed is built for the clarity of the word. Yes, they're looking for musical beauty as well. And remember, even though we're playing continuo from a bass line, that they didn't think in terms of harmony. They thought in terms of counterpoint. So it's the thinking horizontally more than vertically, although of course we're playing chords to the singers. So it's an interesting concept to have to wrap around your brain, but that's what's happening. They didn't think in terms of keys, they thought in terms of modes still. Anyway, let's go into a lot of this guy's translation notes are how he's different from the two other people who translated and published the translations of this piece. He seems to be a real Italian star, but doesn't seem to be that great a musician because some of the way he describes things are weird. Anyway, one thing that's nice is he said, no English word adequately conveys the sense of grazia. And that's in the bottom paragraph in actually the notes of that first page. So, I mean, I think it's easy to call it charm or grace or whatever you want. It doesn't matter. But still, that it shows that that's a quality that they were looking for in the singing. And then let's go to page 4. It's clear then, since I say that such music and musicians weren't giving any other pleasure apart from that which the harmony was giving to hearing only, because it wasn't possible to move the intellect without the understanding of the words. There came to me the thought of introducing a kind of music by means of which someone could, in a way, tell a story in harmony. Using in it, as I have said on other occasions, a kind of lofty, and I don't know why it says spezzatura, but the word is sprezzatura, S-P-R-E-Z-Z-A-T-U-R-A, of song, at times passing through dissonances, but maintaining the chords steady in the bass, except when I want to make use of it for ordinary practice, with the middle parts played by the instrument in order to express some effect, they not being good for anything other. Whence the beginning was made in those times for these songs for solo voice, since it appeared to me that they would have more power to delight and move than do more voices together, I composed this time the madrigals, and he lists some of the madrigals that are, or some of the solo songs, calling them madrigals, in his book. Again, that's a lot of wordy description, but what he means is that we're still using the melody to express things, and that we have the harmony, as it were, played out by usually just a theorbo or maybe a harpsichord, sometimes a small group of instruments, especially in opera. So let's move on to page 5, and let's go to the second paragraph. The vowel U makes for better effect in the soprano voice than the tenor, and the vowel E better, or that's like an I, short I, better in the tenor than the vowel U. All the remainder being in common use, although the open ones are much more sonorous than the closed one, and so more proper and easier to execute the disposizione. So when he says disposizione, what he means is the gorgia that I described before, and disposizione is the position of the throat to enable you to sing that kind of stuff. So that even if these vocal gyrations must be used, let them be made by some rule observed in my works, and not by chance or according to the practice of counterpoint, where in the latter cases it would be necessary to think of them beforehand in the works that someone wants to sing solo, and produce the style to them, pledging in that regard, that, etc., etc. So the funny thing, though, is there are a couple of pieces and there are certain sections of songs that are incredibly florid, with long reams of 16th notes intermixed with some 32nd notes. So, even though they all talk about not being too crazy, if you look at the ornamentation tables of Ragnoni and Bassano, people who also said don't go too far afield, they're just wild. They're just so intensely made with huge amounts of notes. So it makes me wonder, once again, what people did. But I am convinced that they did use a lot of ornamentation in certain places of the effetti type. Now, the affetti type, we have a few different types that particularly popular. I think the first thing, you see this in a lot of places, is the messa da voce, which I imagine everyone knows what a messa da voce is because we still use them. Then we have esclamazione più vivo, or esclamazione plain. And these are sort of the opposite of the messa da voce. So instead of this, And so they use that. There are examples given of how to do that. There's also an esclamazione più viva, which is nice. It's which is slightly different. You find it, these esclamazione are made to express things on one or two notes. So instead of going with Versace, they use just these affects. So that's sort of where we're at in an introduction to ornamentation. I'd like to just say a few words about the vocal registration. From looking at exercises and where the pitches are in descriptions, it would seem as if registration was a bit lighter than it is now. Now we sort of have lower larynx technique. I think in those days, there's no reference to that, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I think they probably allowed the larynx to float a little more instead of sort of allowing it to stay down. And that changes the way things go. You end up being lighter sounding at the top. There's also references to getting softer as you get higher rather than getting fuller. One of my good friends says, yeah, but that doesn't work, even though that's what's written. But we'll see. I think it can, and there are always places for it. Then there's always this sort of the little elephant in the room, and that is what to do about vibrato. And I think that probably, some people say, oh, well, they all sang with vibrato. It was so natural they never discussed it because they didn't think about it. But they thought about everything else, so that doesn't seem probable. I have had some references that I found to vibrato, and so it's clear it was used, but probably more as an effect or kind of like an ornament rather than necessarily a technique. I'm not suggesting anyone try and do that because that's not what you do in your normal singing life. But I do suggest that maybe the vibrato can be lighter in certain places, even in opera, because I think vibrato got heavier and more often used because we were going to bigger and bigger halls through the centuries. I've seen some of the rooms where some of these operas were premiered, and they're pretty small. Some of them just seat really dozens of people, and some of them say a few hundred. But there's no 3,200 Met size opera halls back then. Although they did have some large continuo sections, but basically orchestras are not that big. There'd be you might have 2 or 3 theorbos, lute guitars. You could have a violin band actually playing continuo, actually company. Probably a bass of some sort, double bass. Then you also would have multiple keyboards. But some of the performances were also clearly done with only 2 or 3 continuo instruments and the chamber music, solo songs and these little court bouts. Generally, they had a small amount of continuo and small audiences, and sometimes the singers accompanied themselves. But back to opera, there was really no need to really put out a huge amount of sound. When we get the first professional operas, a little later in the 17th century in Venice, by the way, the operas were mostly court entertainments until the middle of the century, when we actually have 1, 2, then 3 professional opera houses in Venice. That's really the first place outside of doing big entertainments at court. And in that case, the orchestra always only consisted of 2 violins and a continuo bass of some sort, maybe not even a cello, and then a harpsichord and maybe a flute. That's it. Earlier on in the entertainments, the operas and masks and big productions, sometimes they were outdoors even. Like for major court weddings or whatever, there'd be hundreds of people there, and there'd be hundreds of people performing. People in choruses, and more orchestra, and people dancing. There's just some wild drawings of the stages. But that was again only at court. Although the commemorative performances would have included other people, not just courtiers, but people who were allowed to observe, and that would be the time that the townspeople would get to see some of these large entertainments. So, Tom, why don't you join me?
So, the first thing I want to do is just work with you and see if you can get a good trilo going, and then maybe try some groupie and some other things. In other words, singing fast.
Cool. Okay.
With repetition in your throat, and see how it goes.
All right. Well, let's give it a go.
Okay. So that would be here. I'll just sing it down an octave first. We did.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. That's the beginning. So you keep the sound going. Don't do it in your chest or try and do it with your air.
Okay.
But you just interrupt the sound with a slight beating of the glottis. Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay.
So, how to work on this? Try. Well, actually, it's a funny thing because in the Caccini he writes that out with quarter notes and then half notes, 16th notes, etc. But people always say, "Oh, this is how Caccini says to do a trilo," but that's not true. What he says is, "This is how I taught my wonderful wife and my daughters and even my son and my deceased wife how to sing the trilo." So he explains that it's actually an exercise in learning how to do it. So, but he's not suggesting that you necessarily do it that way. If we look at some of the things where he writes trilo, you'll see it's really fast, just on a brief note. So, so you don't have time to do anything like that.
Yeah.
And I think they don't necessarily want you to vary the tempo so much. So try doing a slower trilo, like. Right, but without using your air.
Yeah, that's the hard
Right,
part.
that's the hard part. So the air just goes like that, and then the glottis lightly interrupts it. Almost, pretty close. Just try it again. Okay, that's getting it. So the way to practice that. Oh, so let's try a fast one. Yeah, do it again. about is it was nicknamed goat trill, especially by people who didn't like it. And it's still called a goat trill by, you know, some singers who don't want to do that and are very resistant. They call it, it's a goat trill, it sounds like a goat. So in order to avoid sounding like a goat, you need to be just a little smoother and a little lighter with the instead of See, when you're doing and it sounds like that, what you're actually doing is you're cutting off the air. So remember how I said, I don't even remember if you were still here yet, that Caccini particularly talks about how you don't want to feel it in your throat, you want to feel like it's in your chest, how the air really moves through. And that way you can sing it with normal fine volume without sounding like you're a goat.
I'll try to do
So,
it
so try. If you have a little more vertical in your mouth.
Okay.
Yeah, that's starting to come along, okay? So, for everyone, the way to practice it is like that. So try a round of that, see how it goes. All right, okay, so that's the idea.
Okay.
We just want to get it as smooth as possible. The other thing that it's talked about is that the trilo is the gateway to gorgia. In other words, the trilo is the gateway to singing fast ornaments, because if you can sing or I'll go up then you want to sing then you can do it, right? All you have to do is learn how to get from note to note. And so practicing like that. But in order to be able to do that, you have to start on one note.
Makes sense.
Okay? So start practicing your trilos. The next thing that happens is what I showed you the gruppo before. So that's basically a trilo, but with two notes. Or so we practice. And the gruppo trilo were used in combination. So that's a good thing to practice. Try that up an octave.
I just so instinctively want to use the air to do this.
I totally understand. All right, you get a little area there, but that's
Yeah.
So you just have to practice it. I mean, we'll leave that for now, but that is where you're going to, and that's how you're going to try and learn how to sing fast with gorgia. Give you the and then do that without using your hands. Let's go and look at some of Ulysses.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to be going to not his first scene, where he's just waking up, but we're going to go to where Ulysses meets Minerva. She enters disguised as a shepherd, a male shepherd actually, and tells him that he's, this is his home now, but if he goes to a certain place and does a certain thing, which we'll discover, that he'll be able to disguise himself as an old man, return home, and then we know what happens. He goes home and kills everybody. So the first thing is he's saying, who would believe it? Who would believe it? The goddess here disguised and dressed up as a boy. Who would believe it? Who would believe it? So he's surprised, but he's also happy, right?
Yeah.
So we'll make this a sprightly piece. Okay.
Chi crederebbe mai deità vestite in umanero?
Yeah. Mai deità vestite umanero. So keep the pulse. And
Chi crederebbe mai deità vestite in umanero?
good.
Chi crederebbe mai.
And then, so here we're gonna chi crederebbe mai, and then recitative. So let's do that again.
From the top?
No, from the wretched section.
Oh, sure.
The common time.
Si fanno queste mascherate in cielo.
Okay, so do they have such masquerades in heaven, right? So cielo is your sort of the operative word.
Mhm.
So if we could go, si fanno queste mascherate in cielo.
Si fanno queste mascherate in cielo. Grazie ti rendo.
Right. Grazie ti rendo.
Grazie ti rendo. Oh, protettrice Deo.
Okay. Yeah, good. Dea.
They are.
Yeah. But here's a place where you need to do an ornament. So when we begin with si fanno queste maschera in cielo, and you could si fanno queste mascherate in cielo. Grazie ti rendo, oh protettrice Dea. So there's one. Dea, Dea, Dea. So I have a million of them.
Cool.
So that's what you want to do, is develop this vocabulary so that you can find your cadential ornaments.
So we really have a lot of freedom in pitch-wise what we do there.
Yes, that's sort of what I've been trying to say.
Yeah, okay.
You don't have that much freedom rhythmic-wise,
Mhm.
so you have to keep to the true rhythm, right? You can, as I said, you can move a little sooner, a little later, stretch a little bit, but basically, if you look at what I'm doing in just a continuo player, keep to that. And I have to tune a little bit. Okay, so let's try the rest of it again.
Si fanno queste mascherate in cielo.
Yeah, so if you go mascherate in cielo, if you go mascherate in cielo, it's just too much time. So you could go mascherate in cielo or mascherate in cielo. Just keep the time. That's the important thing. Oh well, one of the many important things.
Si fanno queste mascherate in cielo, grazie ti rendo, oh protettrice Dea.
All right, great. Go on.
Penso che per tuo amore furon senza pensiero i miei pensieri.
Okay, good. So, but again, make sure that that whole note, you know, remember what you talked about, not going too much longer.
Yeah,
So it's written. I think you changed your mind in the middle of it, right? You held it for a while and then said, oh yeah, I got to do an ornament.
I kind of did, yeah. It's kind of, oh right, I have to do a thing.
So let's go from Ben Sol. See what that is?
Penso che per tuo amore furon senza pensiero i miei pensieri.
Yeah. Perire.
Periri.
So, let's try once again.
Penso che per tuo amore furon senza pensiero.
So, let's just try that again from Ben Sol.
Penso che tuo amore furon senza pensiero i miei pensieri.
All right, good. And it's tuo amore, not tuo amore. So the T-U-O.
Tuo amore.
Yeah, T-O is U-O is tuo, not tuo.
Yeah, I was just trying to keep it in rhythm.
That's fine. I'm just saying we want to keep it in rhythm, but always keep the words integrity as well, right?
Yeah.
All right, good. Let's do that whole thing.
Credere mai d'eternità vestite in un angelo. Chi crederebbe mai si fanno queste
Yeah, so now we're we'll be going through. So make sure you really differentiate between
The tempos.
the trio, and rest of the teeth. So when you have your score, put a big mark
Yeah.
after Mai, so you know to really stop there, right? And as we discussed a little bit earlier, so you have two quarter notes, right? Mai, and then a rest. So what you want to make sure is that the Mai, and then we go on.
Right.
So you use the rest as creating a new tempo or a new section.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and not, don't go, my, right? Let's just do one more time from the beginning. Chi crederebbe mai le verità vestite in un alveo? Chi crederebbe mai si fanno queste mascherate in cielo? Grazie ti rendo, oh protettrice Dea. Penso che per tuo amore puro non sapevo I miei pensieri. All right, great. Okay, that's enough of that section for now, but
Cool.
yeah, good work. So you get where we're going with this?
Yeah, I get
And, thanks for being brave and doing this. It's a short, ridiculously short notice and coming through. That's great.
Sorry. Do not read very well, so
Hey, no problem.
apologies about the rhythm problem.
Yeah, no. You're doing great. And the main thing is that you improved a lot in this short couple of minutes. So that's what we want to see. But so now I think a little bit about how to work on the part, right? And how to make sections of it, and where you want to ornament, and how to ornament. That is really fantastic. All right, so yeah, I think that's good for now.
Cool. Yeah.
Let's see. Now I have my pages on the jumble, of course, but do we have any questions at this point? Comments, questions? No?
I'm not seeing any. No, I guess not.
Yeah, because I can't really see on this.
Oh, everybody's pretty quiet.
Yeah, I'll say.
Everybody's very focused, but they're very quiet.
Okay.
I have a
Well, is there
question.
anything you want me to do?
Oh, I'm sorry, Joseph wanted to say.
Sure, I've got a question, which is in cadences where with non-stepwise intervals.
I can't.
Hold on one second. I gotta.
Not a problem. Take your time.
Make-
I'll keep
I
talking
don't have
until
much
you
more
can hear
volume
me.
here. You say the question, then I'll repeat it.
Sure. My question is in cadences where, especially cadences at the end of big sections or big thoughts, where ornamentation would be appropriate. If those cadences are written with non-stepwise motion, so larger intervals like a fourth or a fifth,
Yeah.
How does one approach ornamentation in instances like that, or is that an indication that perhaps ornamentation might not be useful?
So, in cadences with larger intervals, like a fourth or a fifth, is that still a place where you would fill in with ornamentation, or does it
Absolutely.
indicate something else?
No, absolutely. Again, you're free to just do an affect ornament where you would do a messa di voce or something just on the one note beating to the cadence, or you could do, passages, gorgia. Either one is fine. I will soon be sending some ornamentation tables that go by step, by third, by fourth, by fifth, and so you see what is suggested. Some of the things that are suggested.
Those will be really, really useful.
Yeah, I'll send some Ragnoni and I'll send some Bassano, and yeah, I'm actually while I'm away, I can actually write up some ornament tables myself, like taking them from from books, from contemporaneous books, and giving you a little compendium.
That sounds hugely helpful.
I would think it would be.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, we have one here in the house.
Yeah, live. Performance practice wise, did singers stick with certain ornaments, or did they like improv in performance a lot? Or?
Well, it depends on the singer. Now, there's some singers who were known for doing more or less the same thing. I don't think anyone, well, I shouldn't say that. I'm sure some people kind of wrote it out and stuck to the same thing. Some people probably did more or less the same thing, like they had their style, they had their warhorse ornaments, and they did those. Some people really freely ornamented. Now, they did have ornamentation contests from time to time. In fact, there was a noted one with Giulio Caccini's daughter, Francesca Caccini, who herself was a really, really good composer, very noted in her time. And also, considering she's a woman, she was the highest paid singer and guitarist at court, which the fact that she was paid at all was pretty good. So, but she was the highest paid singer. And you can tell from her compositions that she was very accomplished. She also did actually write out some accompaniments in guitar alphabeto. So, I mean, we knew she played guitar as well as theorbo and keyboard. I mean, she was really well trained by her father, obviously. Probably browbeat her every day.
It seems like the ornament thing, there might be some parallels in jazz players, in that some of them have riffs that you'll hear in every solo that they do.
Absolutely. And like jazz music, there's a lot of early music that are basically your charts, and then you learn to improvise over them. You might do similar things a lot of times, but still, so there are chord progressions like I showed with the like that, and then there so people wrote music on top of that. People also improvised on top of that, or did a combination where they played or sang, written music and then ornamented further on top of that. Probably driving the composer a little crazy, but perhaps delighting them. But in any case, there's no question that they did it because there's enough discussion of it, enough evidence.
As we learned today, they complained about it. It was happening.
That's definitely true. And that has never stopped. I mean, I think it goes from the first century to yesterday, probably today.
So it's just a matter of how much do you want to have Monteverdi roll in his grave. Maybe a little bit is appropriate.
I think a little bit is appropriate, and actually, none of them would really roll over in their grave if it was good enough. For all that Caccini talks about, being respectful, the last piece published in his first book, the first Nuova Musica, has divisions by a bass called named Melchior Talantrotti, who was famous for having a huge bassy voice, but also amazing facility. And it actually goes down to a low A, a seventh below the bottom of the bass staff. Wow. And this one only goes up to D. But I mean, I've sung it a million times because I can sing those notes. And but it's one of the few things that gets a little bit written out. It's a strophic song, and he just writes out the verse, and then you have a few other verses, and then the last verse he actually writes out completely with Palantroti's ornamentation, and it's pretty spectacular. Another great example, and I'll definitely send this out because it's amazing. Monteverdi's first published opera is Orfeo. Pretty different style from Ulysses because it was, 30 something years earlier. But in Orfeo, in the second act, there's a really famous piece called Cosente Spirito. Orfeo wants to get into the underworld, and so he's begging them. And it's a fantastic, amazing soliloquy with all kinds of instruments playing ritornelli. They have two cornetos doing one, two violins doing one, and a big harp solo, which so Lila, I mean, they're Baroque harp players for sure, but you didn't have any not too many written solos, put it that way. And to have one, in fact, when you look at the score, it's interesting in Orfeo, the continuo parts are defined, like you said, exactly what instruments are.
So he's orchestrating it
He's
specifically.
orchestrated very specifically, not in his later operas, just in that one. And we know how many theorbos and who plays here. It'll say two theorbos. It'll say wood organ, regular organ, harpsichord, and whatever. And and there's brass too. So there are trombones doing the introduction to that. And in fact, Caronte, who's the guy who rows you across the river Styx, his whole part is accompanied by a really nasty reed organ, which is cool. So they had one of those too. And that's the only time. It's maybe 4 minutes of reed organ, and it just sits there unused. Probably it probably played in the Underworld Sinfonia. And then the harp, it doesn't ever say harp continuo. We just know that
Just the solo.
there's the harp part, and it's a bitch. It's hard. So fantastic. Anyway, so the best thing about this for our purposes is Monteverdi wrote 2 lines, and one fairly plain, and one just spectacularly ornamented. And he says, do one or the other. So, and you know that the first Orfeo was a guy named Francesco Razzi, who was a baritone, low tenor, because those parts are all low. And he was an incredible singer from all accounts. And he sang for all the major composers, Peri and Caccini and all those guys in Florence. And it would seem as if it's possible that it was his ornamentation. And Monteverdi liked it so much, he just wrote it, in the score.
So we get to practice our riffs and then decide which one we want to use.
Yeah, it's like you form a database of good riffs for yourself, and then you do what you want to. The only thing that we have to be careful of, it's not the only thing, but one of the main things we have to be careful of is not going outside the bounds of what the continual chords are going to be.
Right. So,
and you have to watch it with unprepared dissonances and things. You want to make sure that you resolve in the right ways.
I imagine having these tables kind of helps you think of the right direction to go in. And
well, the database that I talked about, it gives you a huge load of ammunition to learn. And since there are a number of pieces and I'm talking pages and pages and pages of these things. Also, you can learn a lot of ornamentation from looking at violin sonatas, because a lot of them have a lot of stuff written out. And there are vocal pieces that have things written out. I mean, the way, I'm sure that the trilo is not ever done or something like that, is because every time it's written out in the same relative bunch of notes.
Mm.
So it might be it might be but you don't see it.
Yeah, so maybe that kind of notation was there to sort of gain control, and then if you've got control, then you can do gradations.
Yeah, but again,
Yeah.
so many times you see a trilo written, even in some of the music we've looked at today,
Yeah.
you have a trilo written just on like a really short note.
Yeah.
So you know it's and that's common. It's really common. In fact, you know, people complain about, well, there's no time to do a trill here. I said, yeah, you do a trilo with like 2 beats.
2 beats, yeah.
And that's all you need.
It's just an articulation.
You know, it's almost like one of those, you know, frou-frou French trills. You know, I mean, I think it serves a lot of the same purpose. So that's what it's there for. It's a grace. It's for grazia.
Great.
Okay. I think I've said what I need to say for today.
Thanks, everybody. Keep looking at the handouts and sort of get what you can out of those, and keep working on translations, because that's the starting point. If the text is there, then we can work on rhythm of the text, and then we can work on how that fits with the beat, and then it all gets a lot easier. Thanks a bunch.
And more stuff to come for me.
We'll get everything posted as we go along. Have a good afternoon, everybody.